like to welcome everyone to our global webinar, the fourth in the series of six, fifth in the series of six. And I'm really pleased to welcome everybody. As you know, we've got a terrific lineup of speakers today on one of the biggest, most controversial issues in world politics, race and racism in the discipline of IR, but also in the making of the modern world and of Anglo-American ideas about world order too. So the idea of this global webinar series is basically to try to put into the same room colleagues, scholars, serious thinkers who have a perspective, who have got a research background and serious interest in big questions of global consequence. And we've tried to basically, regardless of global location, regardless of even whether they're sort of a discipline, regardless of profession, as in from beyond scholarship and so on as well, to try to bring people together who've got something interesting to say about big questions in the world. And that's the point. So we're analyzing the international system of power from multiple perspectives, multiple locations and so on. And the idea being, hopefully, that given that we hear from different perspectives, that the audience and we as participants make connections in our own minds, in our own thinking, about ways to think about the world, which we may not have made otherwise. So that's the kind of basic idea, is to kind of democratize the discussion about global questions by connecting thinkers from a variety of sources and locations and places, and to try to build that kind of audience for those kinds of big questions. We're very pleased that we've got the support of quite a few academic and other institutions. And of course, today with Maribel, we have the executive director of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences, which is one of our supporters. But we're also supported by, obviously, City University's Department of International Politics, the LSE Ideas, the foreign policy think tank there, INEU, which is the Brazilian Society for the Study of the Politics, History and Foreign Policy of the United States, but also the University of West London, the Kassel University's Global Partnerships Network, the Wire news website in New Delhi, and the Center for Hemispheric and US Studies at the University of Havana. So we've got quite a lot of interesting organizations which are very happy to support the kind of things that we're trying to do in a modest sort of way. And that has increased that kind of networks as well. And hopefully that will bring in more ideas, more thinkers, more panels and themes to discuss from a variety of perspectives as well. So with that, the other thing I would say is we do ask our contributors if they're happy to do a short working paper for our website. We are recording these webinars for distribution to those people who couldn't make it. And we are also developing our way of doing podcasts of the series in order to put those onto a platform. And in a way, part of the origins of this global webinar series is really to democratize and diversify the basis of scholarly and serious discussion. And so by making it more widely available as possible, we're also hoping to influence the curriculum and the teaching resources available to colleagues in order more easily to be able to diversify their teaching sources, decolonize the curriculum, and those kinds of things as well. So it's an idea. The idea is basically to democratize knowledge, to provide more perspective, and I'm really pleased to say that I think we've done that relatively successfully, but it's early days yet, and yeah, it's really pleased to see you. And I'd like to hand over now to my co-host, Juvaria Jafri, to introduce our panelists today.
Thank you, Inderjeet. So today's session is on race and racism in the modern world order. Now, the field of IR, international relations, has come under increased scrutiny for not engaging sufficiently with the question of race and racism. Some scholars have gone so far as to say that race and racism should be at the center of this academic discipline. To do this, it is necessary to consider the role of imperialism and nation building in the context of race, but also to consider more closely recent and contemporary events like the war on terror and multilateral agreements. These are some of the questions we will hope to address today with the very impressive group of scholars who are with us here virtually. Before we get into the discussion, I'd like to introduce them very briefly. So our first talk will be from Amitav Acharya. He's Distinguished Professor and the UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges in Governance at the School of International Service at the American University of Washington. His recent books include The Making of Global International Relations, Origins and Evolution of IR at its Centenary, co-authored with Barry Buzan, who's also with us today. His other book is Constructing Global Order, Agency and Change in World Politics, and third book, The End of American World Order. He's also published in various journals, including International Organization, International Security, International Studies Quarterly, Journal of Peace Research, and World Politics. And he has also been president of the International Studies Association for 2014 and 15, and he's received 2 Distinguished Scholar Awards from the ISA for his work on non-Western IR theory and international organization. His talk today will be on race and racism in the founding of modern world order. Our second talk will be from Barry Buzan, who is Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the LSC. He's also a Senior Fellow at LSC Ideas, and he's a Fellow of the British Academy. He also holds honorary positions in Copenhagen and in Beijing. He has written, co-authored, and edited over 30 books, 160 articles and chapters, and lectured, broadcast, or presented papers in over 20 countries. In addition to theory, he has engaged in the public policy debates about security in Europe, South Asia, Southern Africa, and East Asia. His current research interests focus on international society and the English school approach to international relations, international history and international relations, and China and international society. His talk today will be on racism and IR theory. And our third talk will be from Professor Maribel Morey, who is a historian of US philanthropy and the social sciences. She's also founding executive director of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences, which was established in June 2020 to center and amplify the scientific output of global majority scholars across the global South and North. Her book, White Philanthropy, Carnegie Corporations, An American Dilemma, and the Making of a White World Order is forthcoming with the University of North Carolina Press in October 2021. Her talk today is about producing knowledge for a white Anglo-American order. I look forward to the talks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Amitav. Please do go ahead. You have 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Inderjeet. Okay, sorry. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this topic. I should start by confessing that I am actually not a scholar of race or racism. There is a whole body of literature contributed to by very distinguished scholars, including my colleague, Professor Andy Prasad, who spoke here a few weeks ago. And in fact, my interest in race is mainly, initially at least, based on conversations with him. And what is really striking about this is that I was amazed when I finally got to write something about it, and therefore I had to read a lot, that there was so much written, so much good stuff written that I was not aware of. I was just vaguely aware of. I mean, we mentioned race here and there, but to look at it systematically and how it informed not just the study of international relations as a field, but a world order. I mean, again, I had some idea, but not the kind of depth and nuance that I think every scholar of international relations needs to have, including myself. So this has been a great learning experience. And secondly, about it, what I'm going to talk about is based on a paper that I have developed. It's actually a fairly long paper, more than 11,000 words at this point, but it is under review, so I am not going to be able to reveal it. But again, I'm going to only talk very briefly about 2 or 3 key points from it. So I want to start by showing, with the permission from my hosts, a slide, which again, those of you who have done research on racism and race would know about it, and it's not a secret anymore, although it can be denied plausibly by the parties to this, including Foreign Affairs. I don't know, plausibly or implausibly, but this is the trajectory of the first journals of international affairs, which is, by which I mean both policy and academic study of international affairs in the United States. If you can look at, just collated them, and the left side, we have, I forgot, the Journal of Race Development here. This was published in 2010. And the very first issue, this is the first page, written by one of its co-editors, George Blackley, says that the Journal of Race Development offers itself as a forum for the discussion of the problems which relate to the progress of races and states generally considered backward in their standards of civilization. Very interesting choice of words, because he also invokes the standard of civilization. Sometimes we think standard of civilization was a European thing, but actually the United States appropriated it right from the very founding of the, from the 1800s, 19th century, and well into the 20th century, and maybe even today. He also says that it seeks to discover not how weaker races may best to be exploited rather, but how they may best be helped by the stronger. So, no, nothing surprising considering what we know about race and IR today, but still interesting to keep in mind. The reason why I think this is worth repeating is because a lot of people either, they may vaguely know about it, but they may not even know it unless they did research on this. Or I think it's good to repeat, especially I like to show this to my students, undergraduates, who have probably no idea. In fact, a lot of our faculty colleagues have no idea. In fact, another thing which I didn't highlight is that it exempts Japan. The races and states which will be most frequently discussed will be those of India, the Near East, Africa, and the Far East, except in Japan, whose civilization is on a substantial equality with that of the nations of the West. Okay, so this journal, on the 10th issue of this journal in 1919, becomes the Journal of International Relations. The same editor, the same journal, it just changes names. So volume 10 becomes Journal of International Relations, with the same editors, by the way, Blackley and Hall. But in 2020, Foreign Affairs magazine, which is published by the newly established Council on Foreign Relations, takes over Journal of Race Development, and they have a bit of a debate whether to rename it or not, or Journal of International Relations to be renamed or not. And they did decide to rename it. However, it says very clearly here that Journal of International Relations has for several years striven to supply this want and has printed many valuable articles. We have taken over its inheritance and goodwill and appealing to a wider public. So the term inheritance is, to me, very significant, because sometimes people may be confused or miss it, that this was directly inherited. This was not supposed to be a fundamentally different journal with a fundamentally different agenda, at least until the Second World War, when foreign affairs really took off with the Cold War as its sort of more preoccupation and communism. It was basically also had a similar, I would say, agenda. Since it never denied it, it was broader. It did publish articles on race, including some critical articles by Du Bois, for example. But the inheritance is a very important word here. After Second World War, foreign affairs moved a bit away from race and became obsessed with communism. In Britain, on the other hand, internal affairs, which was also found, first issue was in 1922, continued to be obsessed with colonialism. So that's another story. If you look at the first issue of internal affairs, colonialism was the major concern for UK, in Britain, and racism and race was the major concern in foreign affairs in the US until Cold War took over for foreign affairs, and foreign affairs took off. Okay, the reason I said that is because, again, we need to constantly remind ourselves that as a discipline or as a policy project, international relations, especially in the US, has both academic and policy agendas, and they are very closely intertwined. That this was a beginning. This was the beginning. There's no way you can deny that. I wanted to make these three arguments very quickly, now that I have my PowerPoint on. And again, nothing earth-shattering revealing to people who have done research on this. But I am amazed how much correlation there is and how much these things actually resonate. Because each of them are still debated. There are no consensus on this, especially among historians and other scholars, philosophers of not just international relations, historians and philosophers as well. But it may not sound important. I mean, one of the questions I'm facing is what's the new you can talk about? I mean, this has all been done very well in many ways by scholars of race. What am I going to bring to the table? I'm talking about world order. I'm not talking about the discipline of IR, despite what I showed earlier. And I want to make this argument and try to, in my longer paper, show some detailed nuances and linkages, specific linkages, and counter the contrarian argument, which basically challenge what I'm going to say. So racism, slavery, empire, not new. Okay, you'll always find that from Neil Ferguson to all the scholars. What's new about racism? What's new about slavery? What's new about empire? Ferguson talks about in his book, Civilization, that empire was not a European invention. You had empires in the Middle East and India and China and the like. So my argument is that none of them are new, but I do think that scientific racism is new, or was new in the 19th century. But some sort of proto-racism was there before. But the linking of this, the symbiotic link between racism, slavery, and empire is something distinctive and distinctively European contribution to world order. And the modern world order was founded on this link between these three things: racism, slavery, and empire. Take me a long time to explain this, but some of you know about it, but I would be happy to deal with this during the Q&A. This was a symbiotic link and mutually reinforcing. In many ways, that empire was a justification, racism, what people call invention of racism in that period of the rise of the West, was a post facto justification for practices of empire and slavery, which was already in progress. And that's the kind of post facto rationalization of slavery and empire is actually much more graphic and much more elaborate than I had actually thought of. So it was not like slavery came out of racism, as Eric Williams of Trinidad said us. It was actually racism that came out of slavery. And I think I'm convinced of that now. And then on the other side of the picture, establishing and challenging this vicious cycle between colonialism, racism, and denial of human rights. And I want to bring human rights into it because I have a point about why including race as a human in the human rights agenda is not very helpful because racism deserves its own distinctive place, not just as a non-discrimination in the human rights agenda. I'll come back to that later, but it's a key argument I'm making. But establishing that link, identifying that link, was the distinctive contribution of post-colonial nations to world order, which was sidelined and in fact ignored in the making of the UN, especially in the UN Charter in San Francisco and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is a very severe allegation, serious allegation that I am arguing that UN and UDHR basically did not acknowledge, in fact, even pretty close to denying any linkage, marginalizing it, and instead put race under the human rights basket, which then creates all kinds of issues of its own. And that sort of marginalizes racism as a problem of, on its own. Therefore, if I have a policy argument that I think we should pick up on racial equality, it's not been fulfilled as a global norm. It is certainly not fulfilled in the UN Charter or the UDHR or in the covenants that came about, because I've studied them in great detail. Okay, so I don't want to go into details about it, but I think if you look at the making of the UN Charter, we all know about how Woodrow Wilson sabotaged the inclusion of racial equality norm in Versailles. And that story is well known. He did that for a variety of reasons, for domestic politics, for pleasing the dominions of Australia, South Africa, but also for his own innate racism. And it was not a racism of Wilson himself, but also the American delegation as a whole. And again, I have some details on that. But the important thing is that racial equality disappears after Versailles from the discourse. It's not there anywhere in the UN Charter. An issue that was front and center to Versailles disappears in San Francisco. It doesn't get mentioned. I mean, I have done a, content search of all the documents of the San Francisco conference, which are available online, by the way. And you don't find the term racial equality. You do find race and racism, but these are basically subsumed under human rights, non-discrimination on the basis of race and gender and race, sex, and ethnicity and national origin and all. But the UN Charter mentions sovereign equality, self-determination. And I am arguing that sovereign equality and self-determination are not the same as racial equality. If self-determination was same as racial equality, why would Japan demand racial equality? Because Japan was an independent country. It already had self-determination. Sovereign equality doesn't even go close to racial equality because it applies to everyone. It doesn't focus attention to the problems of the so-called darker races. So one has to keep that in mind. So again, other thing is colonialism. Colonialism does get scant mention in the entire San Francisco debate. In fact, it's sometimes seen as a very positive thing. Ian Smuts of South Africa, who was a major figure in Versailles and also in San Francisco, talks about the great colonial empire of Britain, which is agreed to provide economic aid in the framework of ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council. So as you're providing economic aid to these colonies or former colonies, basically since colonialism is great. So one of his statements is that the greatest colonial power on earth is Britain is very happy to go along with ECOSOC and provide aid to countries, which means that if you provide aid, you don't have to worry about colonialism. And colonialism also gets so scant mention, given the fact that so much of the world was under colonialism and there were post-colonial nations represented from Latin America especially. Now, one can argue that colonialism was not a big issue. The United Nations was created basically after World War II. The human rights agenda was the Nazi prosecution of Jews and all that. But still, if you're looking for a forward-looking organization, and there were actually representatives from places like Haiti, and also India was represented not as an independent nation at that time, but it was given a seat under American urging, did participate. They did talk about some of these issues, but it was not really a main part of the agenda. Colonialism is really kind of silent there. And at the very least, this was not a very forward-looking document. The concern was not about colonialism. And we might say that it became more important in the 60s and all, as more countries became independent. But, to say that it was not an issue in the 1940s, it basically says that the Western countries who dominated the agenda, set the agenda, and I've looked at the committee structures of various committees of the UN, who was leading what discourse. It was almost like a deliberate attempt to marginalize and displace colonialism from the agenda. Again, we go to the consequences of bracketing racism. Racism and race became part of the human rights agenda, both in the UN Charter, UDHR. But if you don't have a principle in the UN Charter that is racial equality, then you do lack a bit of a legitimacy and authority. For example, non-intervention was a charter principle. It was in the preamble. Australia put it on the preamble, non-intervention. So non-intervention is seen, and every time something happens, people say, oh, non-intervention is a founding principle of the UN Charter. Racial equality isn't. Now, racial equality comes in human rights as one of several non-discriminations. others being sex, language, they didn't use gender at that time, religion, political and other opinion, national and social origin, property, birth, and other status. But I think that obscures the distinctive role of racism in modern world order. It also allows Western governments to be selective and self-serving in addressing racism. And this is kind of the paragraph that sums it up. Subsuming racial equality within the broad rubric of human rights has had the possibly unintended, maybe intended, result of diluting attention to the racist international policies of Western liberal governments. So by ensuring human rights at home, and many Western governments do try to have legal protection for human rights. So as long as you do that at home, you don't have to worry about what you do abroad. And you can criticize the most brutal repressive governments, regimes abroad, as long as you fulfill your domestic human rights obligations, while you carry out racially motivated approaches in other areas, such as foreign aid, immigration, and refugee relief. And also the West is allowed, so West focuses a lot on political and civil liberties while neglecting social and economic rights. And that's where a lot of racism also happens, in social and economic sphere. So again, I want to talk about it if you want to in detail, but I thought this was quite revealing to me that putting race under human rights might have actually subverted the importance of racism or obscured the importance of racism as a distinctive and important sort of challenge to world order, and obscured the racist foundation of world order. Okay, so in conclusion then, I want to make a couple of points. Race is a kind of a issue in IR these days, international relations, after the anti-racist riots in the US. Even Foreign Policy Magazine and others are coming into discussions about race. But I have a feeling that this is going to be a fad. It was inspired by those protests and riots, and it will probably go away as a lot of fads do. But I may be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. There is a danger of compartmentalization. And this is, I find, in the United States, where a lot of the discussion of race is about America. This is not only a historical disjuncture, but it's also kind of detrimental to the cause. Historical disjuncture because a lot of anti-racist, anti-colonial movements were founded on a transnational basis. For example, the African, Pan-African movement was transnational, Caribbean, Africa, United States. It also even had Indians. Indian nationalist Dadabhai Naoroji attended the first Pan-African Congress in London, for example. So, and the Brussels Anti-Colonial Conference, the Bandung Conference. Bandung Conference was Asia and Africa. So to compartment, and you can also talk about Martin Luther King, you can talk about Nelson Mandela. Race, anti-racism always at a transnational basis, but I do find that a lot of talk about race in the US is national, which is worrying. And then reviving racial equality as a global norm, which is very important, and how it can be done, we can talk about. One last point before I close. Look at the Bandung Conference. The same things that the UN Charter missed, the UDHR missed, were highlighted front and center in the Asia-Africa Conference. It was attended by 29 countries, the first intercontinental conference of colored people in the history of mankind, Sukarno put it. It was actually, in reality, the first intercontinental conference of independent colored people, because the Brussels conference it was intercontinental, but many of the delegates are not independent. So it was the first really post-war conference of independent post-colonial states. But it was more representative of Asia and Africa than San Francisco, by 29 to 13 countries. 29 in Bandung, 13 in UN. Most of the post-colonial states in San Francisco were from Latin America. For them, colonialism was not all that important. They were more interested in regionalism, non-intervention, US power than colonialism. I don't want to say this is a criticism, but this is a fact. You can look at it. Agenda Bandung, exactly the link between sovereignty, racialism, and colonialism. Sovereignty, racialism, and colonialism. On human rights, colonialism in all its manifestation is an evil which should be speedily brought to an end. And the subjection of people to alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation constitutes a denial of fundamental human rights. This was nowhere in the UN Charter debates, very indirectly, maybe in the Trusteeship Council, but Trusteeship Council only had 12 countries, 13 countries, 13 territories, 12 of which were inherited from the League of Nations. So this is basically the demand of the post-colonial states articulated in Bandung, far more representative of Asia and Africa than the UN Charter or the UDHR. I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you so much, Amitav. That was really interesting, and I'm sure it's going to raise quite a few interesting questions at the end of after the speakers have spoken. So thank you so much. Okay, Barry, over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Inderjeet. I'd perhaps say that my qualifications for talking here are not because I'm an expert in racism or race theory or anything like that. But over the last years, I've been working partly with Amitav on the history of international relations, the discipline. And that's what I want to talk about racism in that history. And I've also been working quite a lot on the history of human equality, human inequality and equality, and how that has changed within international society. So I'm coming from those kinds of directions. My talk will be a little bit in parallel with Amitav's, in the sense I'm going to look at international relations before 1945 and then after 1945, and see a big disjuncture there, which is quite an interesting one. And then I'll draw a few conclusions about what I think we should be doing now, as it were. Let me start with the definition, just so we're all on the same page here. So my understanding of racism would go something like this. It's the belief that the division of humankind into distinguishable biological groups by race can and should be used to establish social and political hierarchies in which some races are treated as superior and others as inferior. And that's basically the floor on which I'm going to stand. Now, as Amitav has suggested, at the moment, this is an incredibly contentious issue, not just the Black Lives Matter, but this is a kind of very hot discussion. There may even be some people out there in the audience who think that because I'm a white guy, I don't have a right to speak here. It's that hot a topic. I hope to persuade you that you're wrong, if that's what you think. But that kind of sentiment is out there. So there's a lot of passion associated with this. One of the difficulties of talking about racism, even within a general definition like the one I've given out, is that it covers a huge range of behaviors. Huh? On one end, there's the kind of fascist, in-your-face, very personal, day-to-day racism that you'd find in apartheid states or amongst the Ku Klux Klan and such like. On the other end of the spectrum, there's a kind of implicit, structural racism, which may even be entirely outside the awareness of the alleged perpetrator, but which is nonetheless thought of as being racism because it's kind of built unknowingly into the structure of what's being said or what's being argued. So that range of things makes this a very difficult topic to deal with, and it's important. That distinction is important to the way racism has played in IR. I could, at this point, divert into quite a long discussion about all of the linkages that racism has, which are very interesting. I mean, so you could spend time thinking about the linkages between racism and nationalism, which are both positive and negative. You could think about the linkages between race and cultural and religious differences, which again are also positive and negative. Amitav mentioned the link with slavery, which is much more complex and much more interesting, and in quite surprising ways from what one might think, that the linkage with slavery is a relatively recent one, albeit one that tends to dominate our perspective. Similarly, one could talk a lot about the linkage of racism and empire. Now, and even indeed the linkage of racism and patriarchy. There are interesting literatures on all of this stuff. So the background against which I'm coming from on this is, of course, an English school one. So I'm seeing, or I want to see things in terms of institutions of international society. And from that point of view, I see racism not so much as a thing standing by itself, but as a thing that is part of a larger idea, a larger norm or value, if you like, of human inequality. And it has been true for most of history that most societies were organized around the idea that humans were not equal. And racism was sometimes part of that. So was patriarchy. It was built into empire. It was built into class and caste and slavery and all sorts of other things. Right? So keep that in mind, that racism is part of a larger picture here about a principle of human inequality, which was the norm in most societies in the world up until 1945. All right, let me then turn to the history of international relations, the discipline. And here I'm going to focus on international relations theory. So the first look I want to take is at the period from the 19th century up to 1945. This will require some of you to dispense with the myth that international relations starts in 1919. Right? So the label international relations gets going mainly in 1919, but there's an awful lot of stuff that comes before that, which goes into the emergence of that label at that time. So the history of thinking about international relations, the history of IR theory, if you will, goes way back into the 19th century and even a bit earlier in some cases. So there's a lot of stuff there that isn't thought of as international relations, but I want to make you think of it as being part of it. So the key point here is that during this period, this is the formative period of IR, the 19th and early 20th century. The development of thinking about IR that we think of as the discipline of international relations coincided with the heyday of scientific racism in world politics generally. Duncan Bell puts this nicely in his 2013 book. He says, for the opening decades of the 20th century, race was widely and explicitly considered a fundamental ontological unit of politics, perhaps the most fundamental of all. That was a very widespread view. And that was the view within which thinking about international relations grew up. So it was part of that mainstream way of thinking at that time, and one needs to contextualize it in that way. Now, thinking about international relations took place in bits and pieces during the 19th century. So you can find realism in Clausewitz and Jomini and others. You can find liberalism, Cobden and Bright and others. You can find international society, which was very discussed a lot in international law. You can find strategic studies, Clausewitz and others. You can find geopolitics, Mackinder and a whole load of Germans. You can find Marxism, of course, Marx and all of his followers. You can even find books written on international organization, all before the magic date of 1919. The thing about all of this is that this lays the foundations. I haven't left much out that with the possible exception of constructivism, that constitutes the contemporary realm of IR theory. So all of this stuff was laid down during this period when scientific racism was the norm. Now, the interesting thing about this is that pretty much all of these theories, the possible exception of geopolitics, which is why it took such a hammering after 1945, but pretty much all of this theorizing could have been done without race, a race element in it. Right? In other words, these theories were made compatible with racism because racism was the order of the day. So liberalism could be made compatible with racism by stressing and slightly distorting the idea of meritocracy. And liberalism was also quite happy with empire, so that went along with it as well. There were a lot of people able to combine liberalism and racism. Realism in geopolitics, more obviously, could pick up on ideas of social Darwinism and fit them into their notions of power struggle and all of that. International law and international society was very much based around the notion of a standard of civilization, that only civilized people had international law, and the barbarians and the savages, as they were referred to at that time, did not and could not. They didn't have the right to have international law. So this was also a way of building racism into a theory that didn't, in and of itself, require it. Likewise, Marxism and international political economy could be made compatible with racism through their core periphery structuring of the way the world worked. So the key point here is that a lot of this theory could be made compatible with racism, but didn't require it. And this is important to what happened when we moved to the post-1945 world. So within this period of thinking about IR, there was a lot of really explicit racism. I mean, like Amitav says, if you go back and look at some of this stuff, I mean, the Journal of Race Relations is only one example. Pick up anything written about international relations from before the First World War, and the racism, the level of explicit and unapologetic racism in it will shock you. Right? It's almost unreadable, some of it, which is why some of the early IR scholars like Paul Reinsch in the US, who wrote a lot about international organizations and such like before the First World War, and was a famous figure, as it were, in what was not then a field, but he was a famous figure. You don't hear anything about him these days, because if you look at his stuff, it's almost unreadable in a contemporary perspective. And there were others, Lothrop Stoddard, and as I mentioned, the geopoliticians were a bit notorious for having a strong line in racism. And that just went along with the world around them. The Nazis, Imperial Japan, the Kyoto School, Woodrow Wilson, as Amitav mentioned, that was just the environment that was there. And the development of IR thinking mirrored this. So that's the story up to 1945. It's a story that's largely forgotten and not talked about, but it's very much there and it's very accessible. If you want to look at it, and Amitav and I have discussed this in our recent book. When you come to the post-45 world, the world in which I grew up, there's an incredibly sharp break. Right? Quite a lot of things just disappear, of which all of this racism stuff is part. Right? So, I mean, when I grew up studying IR in the 1960s, racism was not really there at all, except in relation to a couple of specific issues. Israel was thought of by some in that way, and South Africa and the apartheid state was definitely thought of by some in that way. But other than that, there wasn't much of an issue. So when the center of gravity of international relations moved to the US post-45, the explicit racism was just dropped, forgotten, didn't exist, and wasn't recorded as part of the history of the discipline either. It wasn't the only thing that was forgotten. A lot of other things disappeared out of the discussion of IR then as well. There was a strand of feminist thinking and a whole strand of thinking about international political economy, and as I mentioned, geopolitics, all kind of disappeared or were pushed into the background and into the shadows after 1945. With the onset of decolonization, there was a broad shift, as Amitav mentioned, to the idea of human rights and human equality as the default assumption. So this very big jump from an assumption that had reigned for millennia, that humans were not equal, to an assumption that humans were equal. Different game, sudden jump, and you just forget about what happened before. So there was a kind of, in many ways, of which this was one, there was a kind of second founding of the discipline after 1945, with racism shifting to not only shifting to the margins, with its history being largely forgotten, but also, and this is, picks up my earlier point about the broad spectrum of what counts as racism, The racism that became of concern, as it were, was what would now be called structural racism, right? So the in-your-face racism, which was there up until 1945, largely disappeared. And what you get then is concerns. You can find it, for example, in the work of John Vincent, who was one of the few people to write on this, looking at the way racism in terms of Eurocentrism, and the way that a certain part of world history was emphasized at the expense of another part, and the way in which development, underdevelopment could easily kind of subsume racism. So there's a real difficulty here that it's quite hard to disentangle racism from a lot of other associations. From the development, underdevelopment, core periphery kind of thinking. It's very easy to infuse those with a kind of structural racism, which is very different from the very explicit racism that was there before 1945. Now, the main movement, as it were, to try to revive a sense that race and racism is a problem in IR has been, of course, post-colonialism, which has been attacking this kind of structural racism, Orientalism, Eurocentrism, or whatever you'd like to label it, both in international relations and elsewhere within the social sciences. Been doing this since the 1950s, but the momentum has picked up somewhat post-1989. And in some senses, post-colonialism has picked up the voices from the colonial global South, which were always there and always denouncing racism right back into the 19th century and in the early 20th century. They have picked up, in a sense, those voices and tried to bring them into the discipline. But the main concern here is against implicit structural Eurocentric Orientalist type thinking in international relations. So this is part of a much wider concern about the social sciences, because it's not just international relations that has this problem. Now, I personally think there's a lot of merit in this charge. I mean, I've spent a lot of time arguing that international relations as a discipline is incredibly Eurocentric. It pretends that that European culture and European history are world culture and world history, and kind of proceeds from there as if there wasn't any other history or anybody else's political theory or anything like that. And within that, the Anglosphere has been particularly dominant. So how should IR respond to this problem? It seems to me, and this goes again to the work that Amitav and I have done together, that if we're to have any hope at all of constructing a global IR, which takes world history into account and world culture into account, then we need a response to this problem. That the West in particular, the West and Japan, I should say, need to remember and acknowledge and confront within themselves the colonial and racist elements of their past, including in the discipline of IR. And this is all largely forgotten, right? Not too many people in the West want to think about this, but in the global South, this memory is very much kept alive and reproduced diligently. I mean, think of the way that China deploys the idea of the century of humiliation and all of that in its everyday policy, and they keep that going. So this is not going away. Right? It can't just be ignored or forgotten about. That said, however, it does seem to me that we need to keep in mind that racism is one amongst several big issues confronting IR, and arguably not the biggest one. That will annoy some people, but it seems to me that war, environmental problems and climate change, other kinds of inequality than racism, public health issues, migration issues, and all of this kind of stuff are equally or more important issues that IR needs to focus on. Okay? And that, curiously and interestingly, it's increasingly the case that race correlates less with differences in wealth and power and authority than it used to. Right? Wealth, power, and cultural authority used all to be focused on the white West. And increasingly that's less and less the case as China and India and others rise. Right? So to conclude, it seems to me that there are some risks for IR, but also some opportunities. I'm not worrying too much at this point that there's going to be a revival of 19th century style race theory, although I do think that is a fringe danger that one needs to keep an eye on. The emerging Cold War between China and the West could easily develop racist elements, as could, indeed as have, many of the responses to migration in the world. So there's a sense in which there are doors where racism could come back into mainstream thinking about IR. But I don't think that's the main risk, but it needs to be watched. I think there are two main risks that are both to be avoided. One is that the discipline should continue to ignore the issue of racism in the way that it has done over the last decades, because as IR becomes more global, that will fragment the discipline in a very unhelpful way. So this needs to be addressed. I think equally problematic at the other end of the spectrum is the kind of radical anti-racism wing of IR, which threatens tries to make racism the core issue in IR, and threatens to throw the discipline into, I think, a very destructive culture war. Partly because the racism that is of concern is of this structural kind. You could easily find yourself under accusations of writing racist stuff if you cite Hobbes or Hannah Arendt or Carl Schmitt or any one of hundreds, indeed, of people who wrote before 1945, all of whom can be interpreted as racist because that's the context they were working in. I think there may be some interesting lessons that IR can learn here from leftists who, like Chantal Mouffe, for example, who have come to terms with talking about Carl Schmitt because he has interesting things to say, even though he was also an appalling political figure in many respects. So I think, and this is a very English school kind of conclusion, I think we need to find a middle way on this. It needs to start with seeing world history as world history and not just the history of the West in the world, but to bring in all of those other histories properly. It also needs us to figure out how to deal with the legacy of racism in the literature of the IR, not by saying that you can't cite anything written before 1945, but coming to terms with that element in the literature, making it explicit and finding ways of dealing with it so that you can use, as it were, the good bits of that work whilst acknowledging the problematic sides of it. It's quite a big task, but we need to do it if we're going to build a proper global IR. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Barry. That was really very cogent, very interesting, and I think is sure to raise some interesting questions in the Q&A section of our panel. So thank you very much for that. Okay, Maribel, you have 20 minutes to make your presentation. Thank you.
Well, I didn't plan to make an invocation at the beginning, but since my fellow panelists have been talking about the hotness of race and IR, I just wanted to invoke the memory of W.B. Du Bois and his central role in understanding, to use the word central again, the centrality of race in creating racial hierarchy at the world level, at the global level, and creating a world order. So just, even as some of us might feel that we're in this hot moment, there have been scholars who long have been studying the central role of race in the making of a world order. And just to invoke the memory of W.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk in 1903 and Black Reconstruction 1935, we stand on the strength and the foundation of many before us. All right, so I will start here acknowledging the title of my talk, Producing Knowledge for a White Anglo-American World Order. What does it mean to fund, to write, to produce knowledge for a white Anglo-American world order? The type of white Anglo-American supremacy I write about is so pervasive, so condoned at the national level in the US and globally, so condoned by most of the institutions we work with, much of the education we have received, that many of us cannot see it for what it is, white supremacy. For many of us, it is just natural to appeal to a white Anglo-American audience in the academy, in policy, in funding. But it is no accident that US President Joe Biden, former President Donald Trump, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and most presidents and titans of industry in the US and globally have been fellow white Anglo-American men. They are beneficiaries of national and global political economies, many ways in their making that privilege the work and interests of white Anglo-American men, such as themselves. That is white supremacy, white domination over the rest of us. But many of us do not see or do not want to see so much of white Anglo-American dominance in finance, the academy, policymaking as white supremacy. Because what does it mean for us if the very world we exist in, from the Republican to Democratic Party in the US, the right and the left, the elites in the academy, philanthropy across the global north, if it's all a glass box of white Anglo-American supremacy? That feels rather suffocating. Plus, why call this out and in the process risk ostracizing the nice white people, the more benevolent and quite powerful white liberals who are our colleagues in the academy, in philanthropy, in policymaking? Why acknowledge their inclusion in the making of a global white world order that needs to be addressed? Well, because we owe it to ourselves to be honest about the deep work ahead of us if we are indeed trying to quote unquote decolonize, to wrestle with our legacies in white supremacy. We need to not only point the finger at obvious violent forms of white supremacy, but also the forms that seem normal and expected to us. One way of crawling out of the white supremacy that seems normal to us is to question the purposes and aims of government, finance, the academy, and philanthropy when they govern, fund, and study us, the other, the global majority, in the global north and south, or rather minorities in the global north and the global south generally. For example, within the world of the academy and public policymaking, how do dominant scholars and policymakers discuss and define equality with us, the global majority? What alternative forms of knowledge, of governance, perhaps suppressed, could have led and could lead us towards more equitable, sustainable national and international political economies? With that in mind, I will spend time today talking about my book, forthcoming with UNC Press in October, White Philanthropy, Carnegie Corporations, An American Dilemma, and the Making of a White World Order. Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma is, according to US sociologist Alden D. Morris, the most famous and influential study of race ever produced. Supporting the significance of Myrdal's book, published in 1944, political scientist Naomi Murakawa writes that it has been, quote, the touchstone book of racial politics, end quote, with historian Daryl Michael Scott concurring that An American Dilemma was, quote, the era's most important study of Black life in the US. Historian Thomas Sugrue similarly has argued the continued influence of An American Dilemma in US life, and more specifically, how former US President Barack Obama has echoed the language of Gunnar Myrdal in his pronouncements on race. Making both points as he analyzed President Obama's Martin Luther King Day speech in 2008, Sugrue comments that, quote, Obama's high-minded words echo those of Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal, whose 1944 book, An American Dilemma, still defines the basic dynamics of racial politics in America, end quote. Commissioned and financed by Carnegie Corporation of New York and written by Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal, An American Dilemma runs a length of nearly 1,500 pages. That's pretty cool. How many people get to publish 1,500 pages now? Across 2 volumes. It outlines the many facets of white Americans' anti-Black discrimination, from employment, housing, voting, and police and court practices to patterns of direct violence and intimidation, such as lynching and riots. Throughout the volumes, Myrdal relays that these anti-Black discriminatory policies and behavior run counter to Americans' national egalitarian ideals, quote unquote, the American creed. The author subsequently encourages his white American readers to correct their anti-Black discrimination to meet such ideals. Even more, Myrdal stresses that white Americans could make use of an increasingly strong and centralized national government in the US to expedite Black Americans' integration into white American life. Gunnar Myrdal's analysis of anti-Black discrimination as a moral problem in the hearts and minds of white Americans to be solved by appealing to these dominant white Americans to mobilize the national government to assimilate Black Americans and other racialized minorities into dominant white American life remains a powerful tool for Americans to discuss the best means and ends for racial equality in the country. In the 1940s and well into the 1960s, an American dilemma dominated discussions on Black Americans in the US, not only among social scientists, but also policymakers. Most famously, the US Supreme Court in 1954 made explicit mention of an American dilemma in its school desegregation case, Brown v. Board of Education, with the US Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter saying to an American journalist years earlier that, quote, Myrdal's book was indispensable for understanding the race problem, end quote. And yet, even as an American dilemma relatively quickly became a celebrated text among many Americans, it also had its critics, and relatively early on. Predictably, there were steadfast opponents of racial integration or proponents of racial segregation who balked at Myrdal's suggestion that white Americans should expedite Black Americans' assimilation into white American life. Though it was not simply segregationists who found fault with Myrdal's central argument in An American Dilemma. There were also those who, compared to Myrdal's thesis in An American Dilemma, were more firm foes of white supremacy and viewed the book as further justifying white rule in the US. In this vein, for example, Ralph Ellison expressed his ambiguity about An American Dilemma in a review he wrote in 1944, though left unpublished for 2 decades. Here, Ellison explained that Black Americans, quote, must, while joining in the chorus of yeahs, which the book deservedly evoked, utter a lusting and simultaneous nay, end quote. This is because while the study confirmed Black Americans' humanity to white Americans and explained how Black subjugation as a result of the later's anti-Black discrimination, rather than as many white people had liked to believe a result of any inferiority among Black people, Ellison reasoned that Myrdal reconfirmed for white Americans the inferiority of Blackness. And Myrdal did this, Ellison noted, by suggesting in An American Dilemma that racial equality required Black Americans to assimilate into white American life, and in the process, to take on white Americans' denigration of Blackness and privileging of whiteness. Indeed, to Ellison's point, Myrdal had written in An American Dilemma that it is to the advantage of Black Americans, quote, as individuals and as a group to become assimilated into American culture, to acquire the traits held in esteem by the dominant white Americans, end quote. And Myrdal did not simply see this as a practical option. Rather, Myrdal generally devalued Black culture, noting in American Dilemma his, quote, observation that peculiarities in the Black community may be characterized as social pathology, end quote. To this key element of Myrdal's definition of racial equality in An American Dilemma, Ellison commented, quote, it does not occur to Myrdal that many of the Black cultural manifestations, which he considers merely reflective, might also embody a rejection of what he considers, quote unquote, higher values, end quote. Considering that white culture and personality were not, according to Ellison, any bit superior to Black culture and personality, Ellison lamented Myrdal's assumption that Black Americans' equality in the US required acquiescing to white Americans' belief in their cultural superiority. Other early critics of An American Dilemma, such as US scholars Oliver C. Cox, Herbert Apteker, Doxy Wilkerson, and Charles V. Hamilton, along with Trinidadian scholars and activists C.L.R. James and Stokely Carmichael, saw in An American Dilemma an effort to help leading white Anglo-Americans re-justify their dominance as an imperial power both within and beyond the US. In Caste, Class, and Race, 1948, for example, Cox referred to the emphasis on US democracy in An American Dilemma's title and retorted, quote, we shall not discuss the concept from which the book derives its title, for it seems obvious that none of the great imperialist democracies either can or intends to practice its democratic ideals among its subject peoples, end quote. To Cox, Myrdal's emphasis that dominant white Americans, once shown the gap between their democratic ideals and discriminatory treatment and public policies on Black people, would rectify their policies and behavior, was as naive as expecting European imperial powers in Africa to do the same after being shown comparable data. In a similar way, Stokely Carmichael and Charles V. Hamilton argued in Black Power, The Politics of Liberation in America, 1967, that, quote, there is no American dilemma because Black people in this country form a colony, and it is not in the interest of the colonial power to liberate them, end quote. As Carmichael Hamilton Cox and other strident critics of white supremacy since then, such as Samuel Du Bois Cook and Harold Cruz, long have noted, and contrary to Myrdal's message in An American Dilemma, white Americans have not necessarily felt moral stress in their discrimination of Black Americans. And even when some do, for example, Cruz argued in 1967 that, quote, the relationships between groups in America and on the international plane are actuated by the power principle, not by morality and compassion for the underdog classes, end quote. While never publicly critical of An American Dilemma, W.B. Du Bois was privately sympathetic to this critique of Myrdal's work as further justification for white Anglo-American domination. Du Bois biographer David Levering Lewis writes of Du Bois, quote, if he never publicly questioned the Myrdalian concept of moral tension and its muting of economics, there is ample evidence that privately, he concurred with the sharp criticisms of An American Dilemma made by Marxist scholars such as Herbert Apteker, Oliver Cox, and Doxey Wilkerson, who largely dismissed Myrdal's American creed as the opiate of the white liberals, end quote. From such a critical perspective shared by Du Bois and others, Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma served to help leading white Anglo-Americans reconfirm the superiority of whiteness over Blackness and to accept Black Americans' equality on their own terms and at their discretion when they felt that it was expedient to bridge the gap between their egalitarian ideals and discriminatory treatment of Black people. In simplest terms, my book, forthcoming in October, White Philanthropy, amplifies the significance of Black nationalist and leftist critics' perspectives on An American Dilemma. By confirming with historical evidence these critics' claims that An American Dilemma was an exercise in white Anglo-American domination. More specifically, I illustrate how the book was part of Carnegie Corporation President Frederick Keppel's efforts in the 1920s and 30s, a timeline similar to the one you were describing, Amitav. Efforts in the 1920s and 30s to finance social science studies that would help white policymakers in the Anglo-American world address perceived problems in their governance of Black people. Unpacking the text itself, I argue that Myrdal ultimately complemented his funders' intentions for the project by keeping white Americans as his principal audience and guiding them towards a national policy program on Black Americans that would keep intact white domination. Because for Myrdal, as Carnegie Corporation, international order rested on white Anglo-Americans' continued ability to dominate effectively. In the book, I present new and original research on Carnegie Corporation founder Andrew Carnegie's vision for international peace, how this Gilded Age steel tycoon's vision for global peace related to his advocacy of vocational and industrial education for Black people on either side of the Atlantic, and how once Carnegie passed away in 1919, his assistant, James Bertram, translated for fellow board members at Carnegie Corporation his former employer's expectations for international peace, or international order, really, for international order along the color line. For example, by interpreting the corporation's charter, which I can talk about more in the Q&A. Assuming the presidency of Carnegie Corporation in 1923, former Columbia College Dean Frederick Keppel incorporated into this vision of the corporation mandate his own anxieties about the explosive nature of Black nationalism in the 1920s for continued white supremacy across the Atlantic, and his affinity for the developing social sciences as a useful tool for helping white policymakers recalibrate white supremacy and Black subordination in their territories. I thus show how President Keppel's decision to finance An American Dilemma, and before it, the Poor White Study in South Africa, 1932, and Malcolm Haley's An African Survey in 1938, organized via Chatham House in London, were in line with Carnegie Corporation's priorities in the Anglo-American world, and more specifically, part and parcel of Keppel's own developing interest in financing social scientific studies on white and Black people as means of helping white policymakers across the Atlantic find new equilibriums in white domination over Black people. Because, as I mentioned, for this Carnegie Corporation president, much like the corporation's founder, Andrew Carnegie, and later Myrdal, international order rested on white Anglo-Americans' effective domination across oceans. Indeed, Myrdal, who was in routine dialogue with President Keppel, who had commissioned him to head the study, largely delivered on his funders' intentions for the project. Inspired by its experience funding the Poor White Study, and especially an African survey, Carnegie Corporation intended the US study to provide white Americans with means of coordinating policies on Black people across geographic regions in the country, much as an African survey was intended to achieve for white imperial and colonial leaders throughout Africa. In line with Carnegie Corporation's expectations, Myrdal maintained white Americans across the country as his principal audience and guided them towards means of establishing a national policy program on Black Americans that would reinforce the legitimacy of white domination on this part of the ocean, again, much as an African survey was intended to achieve on the other side of the Atlantic. The biggest point of disagreement between funder and grantee, between Keppel and Myrdal, centered around the question of whether the white South was critical for a national policy program on Black Americans. For Keppel, white Southerners were crucial, while for Myrdal, the influence and power of this group did not match that of another group of white Americans he deemed best suited and capable of shepherding such a national policy program, white Americans in the North and the New Deal government. Ultimately, Myrdal explained in American Dilemma that the American Creed could inspire all white Americans, and particularly his target audience of white Northerners and New Dealers, to mobilize the federal government to further assimilate Black Americans into white American life along the lines of white Americans' priorities, described by Myrdal as quote unquote rank order discriminations. Once white Americans started this work of self-correcting themselves toward their moral ideals, Myrdal argued that they would be solving the so-called race problem and in the process re-justifying and restabilizing their domination in the US. As Myrdal found particularly important to emphasize during the Second World War, he furthermore argued in American Dilemma that white Americans needed to solve their so-called race problem because white Anglo-American leadership, and particularly white American leadership across oceans, was critical for international order during and after the Second World War. In the foreword to An American Dilemma, written just as he retired as president of Carnegie Corporation, Keppel, while showing some concern that Myrdal had not sufficiently allured white Southerners in the text, celebrated Myrdal's text alongside the previous two social scientific studies in white rule that the corporation had funded during the span of his tenure as president, the Poor White Study and an African Survey. After all, and even as the two men disagreed on the relative importance of the white South for a national policy program on Black Americans, Myrdal had both fulfilled and surpassed his obligation as director by proposing means for white Americans to come together towards such a national policy program and to stabilize white Anglo-American rule at the international level. Amongst 20th century US scholars, White Philanthropy Intends, the book that's coming out in October, intends to change the way that we talk about the significance and purpose of An American Dilemma in the US. This is because, as I argue, An American Dilemma should be remembered as a project with great dialogue and intent between its funder and author, and a project whose author delivered on the funder's intentions to help white policymakers further solidify a white Anglo-American world order. This book furthermore introduces the scholars analyzing white world making in the 20th century, how An American Dilemma was linked to the Poor White Study and an African Survey as part of Carnegie Corporation's plan in the first half of the 20th century to finance cooperative studies in the social sciences that could help white policymakers in the Anglo-American world address perceived problems in their governance of Black people. And yet, as much as I intend to contribute to scholarly conversations on American Dilemma, I have not written the book simply for that purpose. I also have written it to disrupt contemporary public conversations on racial equality and white supremacy in the US today. Keeping in mind that An American Dilemma continues to frame the ways we talk about racial equality, in the US at least, I suggest that we Americans need to acknowledge that our national conversations on racial equality continue to be intrinsically connected to a history of white domination and Black subjection, both in the US and colonial Africa, and more specifically, rooted in a project among white funders, policymakers, and their advisors in the social sciences and education during the early 20th century to create a world order led by white Anglo-Americans. That said, one must acknowledge that An American Dilemma indeed has played an important discursive role in the US, a progressive discursive role in the US. After all, it is a book written by a white European man whom leading white Anglo-Americans long have treated as authoritative. And Myrdal has conveyed to leading white Americans who trust his knowledge production that anti-Black discrimination runs against US egalitarian ideals, something that many Black scholars long before him and after him were saying. So in this way, An American Dilemma in the US as an African survey in a colonial African context has been a powerful tool in helping Black and other racialized groups on either side of the Atlantic further substantiate to an audience of white Americans and Europeans that their claims for more equitable treatment deserve to be heard. I suggest acknowledging that An American Dilemma indeed has played an important discursive role in the US, though akin to an African survey in colonial Africa. Though for a more egalitarian future, assuming we indeed aim for a world beyond white Anglo-American supremacy, leaving the rest of us dependent on its bouts of benevolence, we need to find inspiration, not in such texts such as An American Dilemma or An African Survey that are only thinly disguised efforts to continue white rule both within and beyond the US, but rather in those individuals who resisted the making of this white Anglo-American world order, such as W.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Oliver C. Cox, Ralph Ellison, and others, many others, including Tuskegee Institute's African history professor during the 1920s that I write about, Simbini Mamba Nkomo. As Du Bois, Garvey, Cox, Ellison, and Nkomo showed through their lives and works, and as many others since then today show through their own lives and works, there are indeed avenues towards more equitable and sustainable national and global communities. We just have to acknowledge white supremacy in all its forms, even in the forms that seem comfortable and normal, learn from our histories, and believe in our collective abilities to govern each other, to lead each other with full dignity and respect at the national, regional, and global levels.
Great. Thank you so much, Maribel. That was so interesting and lively and stimulating, as were the other presentations as well. So thank you to all three speakers. We've got quite a pile up of questions, which will be of interest to one or more of you in each time. The first one that I'd like to present to you is from Dr. Oz Hassan from Warwick. And Oz says that there's a lot of talk about disarticulating racism from IR theory, and that world history is one avenue for doing this. But to what extent do we need to go beyond even this and bring in currents in world philosophy to try to get beyond the meta-theoretical and methodological paradigm wars that we've been engaged in for far too long now? I wonder if, Barry, I think you raised that question of sort of world history as a key factor in disarticulating race and racism from IR. I wonder if you want to take that first, please.
Sure. I mean, I have no disagreement with the point being made at all, so I will be very brief. I think all you have to do is look at the way now that, for example, China is building its way into international relations as the discipline, not just by bringing its own history into it, which is distinctive, but also by bringing its own political theory into it. And to some extent, the history and the political theory go together. If you think about IR as it stands, it's pretty much all an abstraction of Western history and Western political theory. As the Chinese come in and as others come in, bringing their own histories and their own political theories and social theories with them, I would expect that to broaden things out. There's a lot of discussion around the Chinese school that is doing exactly that.
Okay, thank you. Amitav, I wonder, in terms of the kind of research that you've done and the approaches you've taken, to what extent does that kind of material lend itself to a kind of eliminating the kind of legacies of racism within the IR discipline? Do you see, you said racism could well be a fad within the study of IR, but the kind of research that you're doing is uncovering more and more material, which, if you're saying, is fundamental to the construction of world order, and therefore obviously interest to the study of IR. So, yeah.
Well, I don't shape the literature on international relations. I don't shape the discipline of international relations. As you know, only a handful of universities produce PhDs that dominate the hiring market, especially in the US. It's like 15 or 20 IR departments in the US that produce 80% of the faculty in major American universities. And look at their curriculum. I think the key is how we teach our graduate students, PhDs. In Britain, it's maybe different. In US, everybody has to go through the canons, the coursework. And I'm designing one right now. It's a real challenge to convince your colleagues that let's put literature from, initially it was difficult to put women scholars. Now that is become fairly mainstream, but it's impossible to get this kind of literature into your curriculum, whether at the undergraduate, but especially at the graduate level. So that has to be a very important factor. Then the other thing I would say is that it has to probably skip a generation. I mean, sorry, go over this generation. I mean, the current generation, the journals, how many articles you have in IO or well, politics, which are about race. And if we're thinking of this as an important determinant, central not in the sense that it wasn't before, it was central in the 1990s too, but in terms of anti-racism, the consciousness that race was fundamental to the foundation of world order. If you don't get people to sensitize to that, and if we don't teach it, not as an extra additional course on racism, but in every course we teach, then unless we do that, this generation of scholars or the gurus, their work dominates, and they are, at most they're oblivious to the problem. And at worst, they perpetuate this racism. So to me, curriculum reform is curriculum changes are very important. Indeed, there is actually a very interesting report of all places, Council on Foreign Relations, about diversifying IR curriculum, IR studies, just came out, and it cites actually my book, Constructing Global Order, as a kind of example of the kind of literature to use. But I think we need to fundamentally do that. We need to really rethink the way we teach. If we're talking about IR studies, international relations.
But just on that, Amitav, when you've got books like Robert Vitalis's White World Order, Black Power Politics, you've got John Hobson's work on Eurocentrism, as well as on the history of international thought and the role of race and so on within that from 1760 onwards. These are well-researched, well-referenced books. How do you account for the fact that IR seems to kind of, the curriculum, as you say, in these top universities and in sort of very mainstream ways of thinking, seems to carry on as if these books did not and had not uncovered what is the kind of origins of the discipline itself? How do they carry on as usual, despite the fact of the production of this such compelling work?
Well, these books don't figure in. I mean, how many IR courses? Maybe one chapter from Vitalis, maybe one chapter from Hobson. How many courses you see? I'm talking about US, and maybe you are better off in Europe, UK. These books don't get into the curriculum, the qualifying PhD exams. So in the mainstream universities, in the core curriculums. So that's what I am focusing on. I'm actually designing a couple of courses now. One of the reasons I'm very busy is to design a course that makes these foundational. So Vitalis and Hobson or Prasad, there is a lot of very good literature on this, but it's not meant, it's not something you're required to study. And that will take efforts from people like ourselves, but we are also not in a position. If I want to propose something, my PhD director may say, no, this is based on consensus of what you put in the curriculum. And that consensus is a very status quo, the same canons that get to be reproduced. So we need to create really new canons and use these new books, literature as canons, which may be happening a bit, but very slow.
Thank you. I wonder if Maribel might want to take the next question. It's again from Professor Hassan from Warwick, and he asks about what is race? What is our understanding of the realities of race? Is race, he says, is it a real category? Is it virtual? Is it a construct? What is it? And is it possible to define what it is, which may then help us to move towards understanding of how to achieve racial equality? So it's really talking about what do we believe race actually is? Is it real? Is it an objective reality, or is it a construction?
I think Barry gave a really good definition early on what is racism. And one thing, look, soy Maribel Morey, I'm Cuban American. A lot of the research is informed by my own personal journey to what it means to be treated as a person of full equality and dignity, nationally, but also internationally, because we're linked with families and just we're part of a global community. It is what it is. And even so, I think that white-black line is so central. So we talk about what is racism or what is race, that white-black binary that W.B. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass before him, many people have analyzed, that's central for everyone else's sense of equality or inequality, because we are the ones who are analyzing race, or at least the dominant social scientists or policymakers, or even your average, whatever, we're all average people, but someone just not in tune with those kinds of conversations, just talking in family conversations, they're being informed by this general knowledge production. And the knowledge production has been, okay, white is what is not black, and black is what is not white. And then how do we, and I'm speaking from the perspective of the social scientist or policymaker who's trying to define categories of people and respectively their rights associated with them, where do we fit all the other people in between? So once we figure out who's black, then we figure out who's white, and then everyone else is somewhere in between with varying gradations of rights. So what is race? I think it's definitely, I mean, many scholars would say the same. We're all human beings. If an alien came down, would not distinguish us through racial categories, but these are real categories that affect people's ability to live, to survive, to not be shot down by a cop in her bed. So I think that it's has very mortal consequences. And so they matter. And for a lot of us, it should matter to really address it, because our own lives and the lives of other citizens are on the line. And if just for your own self-interest, you want to address it, but also if you want to live in a society that's ethically righteous.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll just stick with you for a moment, Maribel, because we got a question from my colleague Laus Schoenberg, who asks, do you think that Alma Myrdal, Gunnar's partner, contributed to a white Anglo-American international order through her practical and theoretical work on disarmament? If you're familiar with her work.
So I will be honest, and I'm not going to cover up. That's still research I want to do, and in tandem with Gunnar Myrdal's Asian drama. Mm-hmm. But one, I can pivot and tell you, no, I don't know that yet. I'll let you know if you stay in touch. Please stay in touch, and we can have these conversations in the future. But I can say that Myrdal's work at the international level was limited by his own conception of the folk, because his definition of equality, both in Sweden and in the US, was based on assimilating into one folk. Kind of progressive compared to the Third Reich model of the folk at the time, which said, off with your head if you don't fit into this Aryan model. They're like, no, you can assimilate, but much like in the moment, and those it was still assuming one national folk. And so when it came to the international level, how do you create a model of equality when it's different folk? And so he fell off and said the only binding element would be humanitarianism, because there isn't that binding folk. So that's a small way of me saying I'm very interested, and I look forward to addressing those questions. Are very important.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question for you, Barry, from Richard Daff from Sheffield, who asks whether you think that the development of a more inclusive and representative global governance architecture could help construct the necessary global IR discourse. His own research, he says, suggests the fine line between foreign policy-oriented nationalism and jingoistic racism, usually filtered through a lens of othering aimed at a domestic audience. Could this proposed new global architecture help prevent othering? I don't mean the move from G7 to G10, but is it possible that the kind of a broader kind of global governance architecture could then broaden out the way in which IR itself as a discipline covers world history, world philosophy, perhaps, and so on?
Okay, that reminds me of a very good remark by my colleague Oli Weber, who once said, anything is possible, it only depends how many other things have to change in order to make it so. I've always liked that remark, and I think it applies very much to this question, right? So, okay, global governance architecture. You want more of it, or the questioner seems to want a lot more of it, right? And maybe if there was a lot more of it, then it would work in that way. Although you've got a chicken egg problem as to whether you need the architecture first or whether you need that way of thinking in order to produce the architecture. This therefore seems to me to fall in a sense into the utopian bracket, where I don't spend much time. my own take on this would be an English school one, that what we've got is a kind of thin but interesting international society, which is a lot better than having nothing, but very far away from having, as it were, an architecture of global governance that had any kind of authority attached to it. And that in a sense, it's more important to think about what we've got and how to work with it than to, as it were, idealize about what we might have and what that might do for us if we had it, because we don't know how to get there. So that, in brief, that would be my kind of response.
There's a continuation kind of question on that theme from Professor Felipe Loureiro from Brazil, who says, you mentioned, Barry, that one of the challenges for IR is to move away from a Eurocentric point of view to work towards building a global IR based on what you called global history and global culture. But to what extent does this global perspective, and to what extent could it end up just adding several local and regional pieces to IR without truly connecting them and failing effectively to take account of structural relations and power asymmetries? That is, you just tack on a little bit of other people's ideas and history onto something which you already teach, but it doesn't actually necessarily deal with the fundamental underlying inequalities that remain. It's a really good question, actually.
It's a very good question, yes. And like all good questions, it's very difficult to answer. In the sense, yes, okay, you can see a certain amount of tacking on. And I mean, I revert back to the example I gave earlier of the Chinese work to build a Chinese school, or however you want to refer to it, but to root thinking about international relations in Chinese history and in Chinese political theory, and to see, you could ask yourself the hypothetical question, what would international relations look like if it had been invented in China, or indeed India, or the Islamic world, or anywhere else? It wouldn't look like it looks now. So there'd be two ways of thinking about the idea of tacking on. One, that tacking on some stuff is better than not at all, right? Better than just staying with the Western model, but it's not good enough, right? That in some way, and here I'm going to play the idealist myself, I suppose, in some way we need to think about how to create a more integrated global history, not just to tell Western history and Chinese history and Russian history and South Asian history and African history kind of side by side, and then kind of see if there's anything similar with them. But how do you tell a world history, a proper global world history, which has themes that put all of these others into context and connect them, right? Now that seems to me to be where the big intellectual challenge lies. But I can see how it could be that just taking the tacking on approach might be a kind of dead end, in the sense if that's as far as it gets, it's not good enough, and it might be a tactic for kind of just a little bit of recognition without actually moving away from the Western core. So those are worries that you'd have to have. But I certainly think it's better. I mean, I can remember going back to the 1960s again, if you'll forgive me for mentioning it again, but Cal Holstein, who I had the privilege of having as a teacher and who inspired me to get involved in this subject, in his textbook on the subject, first edition in 1967, he actually had a little, few sections in there on Chinese IR and the Warring States period and one or two other things. And at the time, that was completely amazing, right? Because that just wasn't there in any other book. So, okay, it wasn't enough, but it was a start.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Got an interesting question now for Amitav from Dr. Atul Bhardwaj, who's a visiting fellow at City University, but based in New Delhi. And he's basically kind of trying to differentiate the global South and the roles of different states within it, perhaps. And he says that why is it that post-war Indian leaders hardly criticize racism inside the United States, but at the same time talked about Black internationalism? And he asked, did post-colonial states like India help manage decolonization in Africa on behalf of the Anglo-Americans, as in, were they actually sort of witting or unwitting agents of the sort of Western order? And did the foreign policy elite policy of a non-alignment actually facilitate the socialization of African countries into the liberal international order, as to what Maribel obviously calls the white world order? So that is to say that in a way we kind of tend to look at the non-aligned movement and the global south and so on as a block. But what Atul is asking about, are there schisms and different roles within? And actually last week, Omar Dahi from UMass Amherst also talked about the bifurcation of the global south into the kind of emerging global south, which has sort of middle class, aspirational and uplifting, and the rest of the south, which kind of was the bigger block, but had a completely different role. And I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about Atul's really interesting question.
Right. So first of all, the direct answer to the question would be that it was probably Nehru personally responsible for that outcome, where the India did not criticize domestic racism in the US as much as it should have. But I think you should to take a look at some of his earlier writing, and there is actually a recognition of racial injustice in the US and racial exploitation in the US. But generally, once he becomes prime minister, after he has written all his big books, he wants to, well, he was an internationalist. And I think you're right that he got captured by this liberal internationalist framing or discourse. But having said that, the non-aligned movement and Bandung had multiple dimensions. So anti-colonialism was the foremost, the number one. Anti-racialism was a cousin of that, but not the same. I think they wanted to get countries independent before they address other problems like racialism, because there was also racialism within countries, within those global post-colonial nations. And then there was also an aspiration for a voice in world affairs. So whatever they could do to get that voice to be recognized as consequential actors drove them. So that and there was the ideology. I mean, the Cold War. They didn't want to take sides in the Cold War. I mean, so there was security motivation as well. So all these were together, and sometimes they worked in cross purposes. So I think Nehru was, in some ways, underwent a change. He was first very strong supporter of the Soviet Union. He visited Soviet Union and admired it. Then he became very friendly with the United States before Dulles, the first initially under Eisenhower. Then he became very friendly with Kennedy. Then he fell out. Then he died, of course, losing the war in China. So he was quite inconsistent on this. But I think your question is right, that Indian leaders did not do as much as they could have criticizing racism in the US. And I also want to say, I don't think India was really front and center in supporting or managing African independence. And I think there was a rhetoric of that. But in terms of providing practical aid, India did not even support Southeast Asian countries, where it was much closer to India. And this is one reason why Ho Chi Minh got disillusioned with Nehru. So, but your question is a good one. I think the liberal order was hegemonic in one sense. It did co-opt even leaders like Nehru. And Nehru personally, as you know, very friendly with the British, Mountbatten, very friendly with Western leaders. So part of the reason for what the puzzle you are raising has to do with Jawaharlal Nehru, who was undisputedly the more major crafter of Indian foreign policy in the first 20, 25 years.
Thank you, Amitav. We've got a couple of questions for you, Maribel. They're a little bit left field. One of them is, do you think Hollywood has an effect on the continuation of racism in the United States? Or is it, as some right-wing people say, it's a kind of bastion of liberal political correctness and so on? And then the other question is, it's about white supremacy and whether or not, whether you believe that until today in the USA, there is a vision that progress is related to white supremacy, that Black people's culture is related to sort of sort of immaturity, primitivism, and so on. So two kind of unrelated questions, but well, not directly related, but quite enthusiastically asked.
So I'll respond to the Hollywood one as best as I can see it from my framing. I would say racism, and by that, I will subscribe to Barry's definition. I'm comfortable with it. Attributing someone to a racial category and then associating them with creating a racial hierarchy of it, and then determining rights and public policies accordingly. Assuming a different worth for different racial categories. I'm paraphrasing you, Barry, but I hope it's okay. And okay, it's so deep. It's in all we do and breathe. So I think sometimes we miss that from our micro decisions, of course, movies we watch, and of course, Supreme Court decisions. But even as scholars, let me just pivot there because I'll go to my next one. The choices we make about whose work we read, even what adjectives we use to describe it. You could do it. I'm sure there's research on it, but how many times, groundbreaking or, field defining, how many times are those words used for global majority scholars' work? So the micro decisions from who we cite, who we read, what questions we think are central, even though we talked about in this conversation at some level, this being a hot topic for whom? For whom is racism or race at the international level in the making of an international or world order new? And if we continue to just assume that what's hot is what that powerful source, white, Anglo-American in many ways, if you talk about central academic institutions still being in the US and UK, then that's very narrow. So I would say on the last question from Ivan Ferraz, I think it's important to just put that lens to the side, not always be responding to what that particular elite, powerful, scholarly community thinks is hot or new or who you need to cite. It's also very powerful to say, I'm going to take a break from that and actually respond and be in dialogue with less powerful scholars who've been doing this work for a long time, because it's really meaningful and really purposeful. And there's something very powerful and helpful about amplifying that work. Again, I'll plug the Miami Institute. That's something that we're trying to do in tandem with Inderjeet's and Juvaria's webinar here. But yeah, I think that it's pervasive, and it goes from our micro decisions in the day to the macro. And as scholars, we have a central role to analyze, even in our very micro work, how racism is playing a part.
Great, thank you. And that's the last word for today. Thank you very much, Maribel. I want to thank our speakers. I think the key thing is that there is a movement for change. I'm not sure that it's necessarily a fad, or it may have a faddish dimension, but it's very deep-seated, as Barry said. The kind of fundamental recognition of Orientalism, post-colonial kind of theory, and the importance of race that brought into the discipline is not going to go anywhere. In fact, it's gathered momentum, though sometimes its directions may well be questionable as well, and its strategies may be questionable. So what we put on the agenda today, I think, and discussed, is a fundamental question which is going to carry on for a long time. But to my mind, with this global webinars and the work Maribel is doing as well at the Miami Institute, it is how do we organize and how do we deliver? What does global knowledge look like? And I'm myself not even sure that there is such a thing. I think maybe it's a process. It's a kind of way in which we think, but I think there isn't global knowledge. There is just knowledge about the world, which is brought from different perspectives, which takes into account a far wider range of forces and voices than we might have done in the past. It'll probably never be a satisfactory global knowledge, but it'll be a much better than the kind of national and sort of region-centric or Eurocentric knowledges with which we are kind of lumbered largely at the moment. But anyway,
can I make a quick plug for a series of global IR dialogues that we are hosting at my school? And the third one is next week, 24th March at 10 a.m. and they're called Global IR Dialogues. So we had 2 very successful ones, and the third one on 24th. This is precisely the conversation we're having. Production of global knowledge in IR, in international relations, broadly defined international studies. And we do bring in people from all over the world. So the next speaker cast would be Deepsika Shahi from Delhi University, Jack Snyder from Columbia University, Nora Fisher-Onar from San Francisco University, and from Bendulka Kawalkawa from Miami University, actually. And we have had, constructivists, realists, liberals, Marxists. So this is because we are not having a conversation among the like-minded. We're actually having this conversation across theoretical divides, and sometimes it can be quite heated. We have feminists, Ann Tickner, Cynthia Enlow. Cynthia was in the first dialogue. So and Randy Prasad, we're having conversations about race. And the whole idea is what you were just saying, that expanding the sources and bases of knowledge, but also making each other conscious of how we feel. We don't feel good about the current American dominated IR, when these are the ways to change it. So these are perspectives from the US, from UK, from Europe. We had, I guess, we had some European scholars, more are coming. We're going to continue this in the fall. Patrick Jackson and I are coordinating it. So some of you will be invited as speakers, but as we continue this, but I want to make a plug. The next one is at on Wednesday, 24th at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Well, that sounds amazing. It'd be great if you could please send us a link and a tweet.
I'll send you the link.
Like that, we can then amplify it.
Well, I thought you follow me on Twitter. It's always on my
I
Twitter.
follow you on Twitter very avidly, actually.
Okay, I will send it to you. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Maribel. Thank you, Amitav.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank
discussion.
you, Inderjeet, and
Thank you to the audience for brilliant questions as well. There were many more which we couldn't really get round to, but I think we'd addressed some of the really big issues. And thank you, Juvaria, for everything you do for these webinars as well. And Tanya, of course, without whom we wouldn't be able to function at all. Right, great. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend and see you again soon at next week for where we talk about empires of the mind, knowledge and power in world politics. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Inderjeet. Bye. Bye, Barry. Bye, Juvaria.
Bye-bye.